Okay, so we are going to learn. This is essentially the title slide is bad. It's Jews in Spain in the 15th century, but really, what it should be titled is the birth of the Marranos. So I think we've all heard about the Marranos, the secret Jews, this very uniquely Spanish phenomenon of Jews who secretly kept Jews and outwardly were part of Christian culture. What I'm hoping to do in this series, by the way, is really take you through the story of the secret Jews and of Christian Spain, the expulsion, and then there are lots of other pieces of absolutely fascinating stories that happen after this. So those stories will include the birth of great Jewish centers like Amsterdam, New York, Philadelphia, in the Spanish-Portuguese community. They will also include the great explosion of remarkable Torah after Spain in the community which is called Gerush Sfarad. And we will also ultimately get to a phenomenon that cannot really be divorced from any of this, which is the great tragedy of Shabbatai Tzvi, the false Messiah. That is going to be the great sweep of everything we're going to do here. But today, we're going to look at one question principally, which is, how did this phenomenon of the Marrano get born? How did we come to a group of secret Jews, which really never existed on this scale at any point in Jewish history before or after? So in order to set the stage, we need to know where we're dealing with. And we need to understand a little bit about the background. So first layer of background is just the geography. At this point in time, Spain is not a single country. There are two different states, maybe three at this point. Portugal is not really so involved in this particular scenario, but the two major centers are Castile and Aragon. So Castile over here, Aragon over here, and these are two very weak kings that are going to exist in this time. And I want to just share with you a little bit about the rulers at this time, because it gives you a real flavor for what's going on. The kings at this time were incredibly weak. The nobles ran roughshod over them. They were constantly needing to recruit in order to fight the Muslims. And you have a fascinating scenario. I just took two of maybe the most prominent examples. One is Sancho el Bravo. Sancho el Bravo leads a rebellion against his own father, Alfonso, and he buys the loyalty of the nobles by giving away crown lands. And he ultimately is the king who come to the throne essentially by sacking his own father. So you kind of get the idea that this is a bit of a rough and tumble place. It's a little bit like a mafia. Another great example is Henry of Trastamara, who's also known as Henry the Fratricidal. He ultimately ends up killing his own brother, and who was known as Pedro the Cruel. You can't make up these names. In fact, his cruelty cost him the throne and allowed Henry to pull a lot of the other nobles into his circle of influence. The reason I start with these two is because I want you to understand that the crown is very weak, and that's a very important piece of this puzzle. You can't really appreciate how important the government is to the Jews. The Jews have only one natural partner in this period of time, and that partner is going to be the king, because the king is going to be interested in gold, and gold is what you get when you have Jews, because Jews are good at trading. Jews are the economic engine. Jews are also good at the diplomatic corps. They speak Arabic. They are trusted by the Muslims. They are necessary to be able to trade in foreign ports. You need good Jews to stimulate your economy, but they promote lots of enmity and jealousy amongst the lower ranks, sometimes even against the nobility. And we're going to see a little bit later on that some people even see them as sort of the agents of the king, and you can't take out your anger on the king because he's got the soldiers, but maybe you can take out your anger on the king's hated agents. Similarly, the church is going to have real trouble with the Jews, but the church is going to have another bit of a challenge here at this point as well. And one of the challenges of the church is that the popes actually were very much against forced conversion. The popes, this is a best picture I could get of Pope Gregory the Great, 1590 to 604, and he condemns forced conversions. And forced conversions happened throughout the Middle Ages. And one of the direct comparisons between the Marrano situation and other forced conversions, or perhaps the best parallel example, is going to be that of the Crusades. Now, the Crusades are famous in Jewish liturgy for the martyrdom of the Crusaders. But there were many Jews who, under the Crusaders, decided to take the cross as opposed to the sword. And maybe the most famous example is going to be the son of Rabbeinu Gershon Meor Hagola, the Rabbeinu Gershon, the light of the exile. So Rabbeinu Gershon, his son is forcibly converted. He dies, and Rabbeinu Gershon sits shiva for him. So this is a little bit, the old, this is kind of the kind of thing that when your child marries out, that sometimes people start to sit shiva. Well, what's interesting is that Rabbeinu Gershon gives us an example of someone who did sit shiva for his child who went out of the faith. He, in fact, sat 2 weeks of shiva, 1 week for the son and another week for Hashem, who has to deal with a child who strayed, who was never allowed to return. We have chuvot of Rashi, of converts who wish to return. And essentially, for theological reasons, the church just did not want, false converts. And they didn't want conversion under duress. And so the Pope, as what became church policy for a long time, the church essentially rejected this idea. Now, the real problem we have, though, is that during this period of time, as we enter into the 15th century, we have a very interesting scenario. It's in historical terms, they call it the Western Schism. But what it means is that there were three, maybe sometimes more than three popes. There was one pope in Avignon, who was sort of answered or was controlled by the French crown. You had a pope in Rome, and you also had a pope in Pisa. And so from 1378 to 1417, there's not really any one pope. There are three popes. And this sort of, to use a Yiddish term, this Hefkerwelt amongst the popes creates a real problem for us. And so there is no pope to appeal to. Historically, the Jews had been able to appeal to the popes and appeal to the higher-ups in the church in order to protect them. As an example, in 1096, when the Crusader armies come through the cities of Mainz and Worms to convert the Jews, or to give them the option of convert or die, the place where the Jews take refuge is in the palace of the archbishop, because the church didn't want it was not interested in forced conversions. And so, but here we have a really unique situation. We have a situation where both the crown is weak, and we have the situation where the church is weak. And now, if the crown is weak and the church is weak, who's going to protect the Jews? And then enter the scene 1391. Now, we're going to go in through month by month, and maybe I should have listed these events as we go through month by month. October of 1390. Juan I of Castile dies, and he leaves an infant son, Henry III. So essentially, the king is a baby. And what happens when the king is a baby? When the king is a baby, the queen mother, Leonora, governs in his minority as when he's a child, right? I know nowadays, 10-year-olds can make lots of decisions. They do. But back then, people were wise enough to know that when you're a kid, you don't get to make the decisions. Now, the queen, Leonora, had a confessor. Her priest, her personal priest, was one of those people who should be put up in the Hall of Fame. There's Pharaoh, there's Haman, there's Khmelnytsky, and then there's maybe Hitler. Those are the guys who I should say that those are the guys who are up on our Hall of Shame. So one of these individuals who should be in that hall is Ferran Martinez. So Ferran Martinez is the archdeacon of a city called, I believe if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Ecija. Ecija is this city here in Spain. You can see where it resides down here in the bottom corner of Spain. And he is the confessor to the queen, but he's also this sort of populist preacher. And there is a position that exists throughout the history of the world of people who have the gift of speech, of rousing people up. In our day, I'm not suggesting that in our day there are people who can mobilize a crowd by the power of their speech. You might pick an Alex Jones kind of figure who gets people to go pry around in Sandy Hook. You might pick, an Al Sharpton kind of figure who in his day could whip up a whole crowd, a Jesse Jackson. There are, my dog Mabel might be another example there in the background. But another ancient example, people who did not have a radio or another platform like that, were people like Savonarola, the famous Florentine priest who convinced people to throw their luxuries into a pile and burn them in the bonfire of the vanities. Excuse me 1 second. So this Ferran Martinez was famous for giving these fiery sermons against the Jews. He would whip people up and he would foment anti-Semitism, and the Pope tried to silence him and the king tried to silence him, but no one was really able to do this. And so comes Ash Wednesday, March 15th, 1391. He throws into a sermon and a mob breaks out and they go to the Juderia, the Jewish section of the city, and the captain of the guard, Alvar Perez de Guzman, is essentially the chief of the police. He takes the ringleaders of this mob and he publicly flogs them. But then the rioters overpower him. They throw Guzman into jail, and you have Hefkerveld. You've now got the mob in control of the whole situation. In principle, you would want the king to send his soldiers and army to deal with the mob. The problem is, after the death of the king, you have a weak monarchy to begin with. B, you have these nobles who are saying, no, we have to keep the army close to us because we don't know if we're going to be sacked by a rival faction, right? So that the army can't even step in. And so what a scholar who I'm going to quote a little bit more later, Yirmiyahu Yovel, calls, he says that you had a violent orgy that spills out into this situation where there are records of entire families, including their children and slaves, running into the city to beat up Jews and to essentially kill the infidel. And the only way for Jews to save themselves was to run to the church and become Christians. And Martinez is going to continue to fan the flames against the Jews. And he's going to, and I just want to read to you the description that was written by a famous Jewish historian, Cecil Roth, who writes a book, and his book is actually titled The Marranos. Here, I'll give you the actual title. I say this because Marcus said to me, wait a minute, isn't Marranos a derogatory term? Don't we prefer the term anusim? And it's possible that we do prefer that term, anusim. Anusim means the ones who are under duress. And you know, maybe that's something for me to try and collect for a little bit later, is a little bit more on the terminology. But many of the books, both you know, at the end of last century, or from the 20th and the 21st century, are all use this term, the Marranos. So we'll have to investigate that. But this is what I'm about to read to you is from Cecil Roth's Marranos. It says, he says, at length, on June 4th, 1391, the mob could no longer be restrained. An orgy of carnage raged in the city. The Juderia was pitilessly sacked. As many as 4,000 persons, it was estimated, were killed, while those who did not succeed in making good their escape were able to save their lives only by accepting baptism. The fury spread during that summer and autumn through the whole of the peninsula, from the Pyrenees to the Straits of Gibraltar. At the Chita, at Carmona, the whole community was exterminated. At Cordoba, the entire Juderia was reduced to ashes. Toledo was the scene of a frightful massacre on the fast day, the 17th of Tammuz. Similar outbreaks took place in 70 other towns in Castile. In Aragon, despite the severe measures taken by King Juan I to suppress the disorders, the example was followed. In the kingdom of Valencia, in the capital city, of which the lead had been given on July the 9th by a crowd of historical boys, not a single professing Jew was left alive. At Barcelona, in spite of the protection of the authorities, the whole community was wiped out. From Catalonia, the frenzy spread to the Balearic Islands, where on August the 2nd, an exterminatory massacre took place at Palma. The total number of victims was said to have amounted to as many as 50,000 in all. Spanish Jewry accounted for, at the time, 2/3 of all Jewry in the world. It was the greatest Jewish community and the most populous Jewish community. That's a parenthetical. Back to Roth. There were some important communities, for example, that of Barcelona, which had maintained an unbroken existence from the 8th century, at which henceforth were never reestablished. Outbreaks were avoided only in Muslim Granada, and thanks to the vigorous measures of protection taken by the crown in Portugal. In Aragon, those responsible for the disorders were punished, though in most cases not too severely. In Castile, however, the passivity of the authorities showed that they condoned the outrages which had been committed. So here you've got you've got this massive pogrom which takes place all in one day. Just to give you a little bit more, it starts in one day and it goes throughout, and of course it's not accidental for us. The tragic times of the year, right? It goes Shivasa B'Tammuz to Tisha B'Av. This is a letter that we have. You know, if you want to know where do we get some of this information, Chazdai Kreskas is one of the leading rabbis of the day. He is a rabbi and a philosopher. He was, by the way, we'll see maybe a good reason why, he was anti-Maimonidean. And we'll see how Maimonides' philosophy may have played into this whole discussion. But he says, if I were to tell you the numerous sufferings we have endured, you would be dumbfounded at the thought of them. I will therefore set before you only a brief detail of table of disaster set with poisonous plant and wormwood, giving you a bare recital of the facts so you may satiate yourself on the bitterness of our wormwood and drink from the wine of our grief. I suppose that you've been told the story already. I will count it as briefly as possible, commencing as follows. On the new moon of the faithful month of Tammuz 5151, the Lord bent the bow of the enemies against the populous community of Seville, where there were 6,000 to 7,000 heads of family. They were destroyed, their gates by fire, and killed in a very great number of people. The majority, however, changed their faith. This is different. 1096, people took the sword. They killed themselves. Here, the majority of people changed their faith. Many of them children as well as women were sold to the Muslims, so that the streets occupied the Jews have become empty. They were sold as slaves. Many of them, sanctifying the holy name, endured death, but many also broke the holy covenant. From there, the fire spread and consumed all the cedars of the Lebanon, referring to the prayer of Yom Kippur, Arzeh HaLevanon. In the holy community of the city of Cordova, here too many changed their faith, and the community became desolate. On that day of misery and punishment, on which the sufferings were intensified, the wrath of the Lord was discharged on the holy city, the source of learning and the word of the Lord, namely the community of Toledo. And in the temple of the Lord, the priests and the learned were murdered. In that very place of the rabbis, descendants of the virtuous, excellent Rabbeinu Asher of blessed memory, together with their children and pupils, sanctified the holy name. However, many who had not the courage to save their souls changed their faith too. The country trembled even on account of these three communities, apart from the others in their neighborhood, to the number of 70. And with all, we were in the greatest danger here. He goes on, and I just show you the other communities that he lets us know about. Mallorca, Barcelona, Lerida, Girona, Valencia, right? He tells us of all of these places, tells us about Aragon, and he will also tell us about the death of his own son, his little lamb, that was killed in all of this violence. He says here, amongst the many who sanctified the name of God was my only son, who was a bridegroom, and who I have offered as a faultless lamb for sacrifice. I submit to God's judges and take comfort in the thought of his excellent portion in his delightful lot. Among them were many who slaughtered themselves, and others who threw themselves down from the tower, and whose limbs were already broken before they reached halfway down the tower. You can see this letter is obviously dripping with emotion. He's personally affected. But one small takeaway from this is to see that together with the martyrdom, he also is going to tell us about the many people who convert. And the question that we've sort of been putting up there is, what's the difference between 1096 and 1391? 1096 is the first Crusades. Those are the Ashkenazic version. Mainz, Speyer, Worms, the Crusaders march through, and they have heroic martyrdom. In 1391, there is mass conversion. And the question is why? What was the difference between the two? And we're going to look at a number of different answers to this question. There are some who take a philosophical approach. This is Fritz Baer, one of the founding scholars at the Hebrew University. He writes very important books, History of the Jews of Christian Spain, and he lays out in detail what he thinks is the problem of essentially a corrupt philosophy. And so he says as follows. He says that this is a letter from the member of the nobility, sort of giving you the mental space of the Spanish upper class. It says the object of all the commandments is the comprehension of intellectual concepts. And in support of this, they cite the worthy verse, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God. Around this axis, their exegesis resolved. They also cite as proof what the Torah says about the love of God. For who, they say, can love him that does not know him? Not only this, but they have subordinated the practice of the commandments to theory, so much so that they have invented a rationalism, forgotten the entire purpose of the commandments, and argued that the object of the laws concerning tithing, gleaning, and so forth is to instill the soul the spirit of charity. basically, it's about a good feeling. Judaism is about feeling the right thing. You don't really have to do the mitzvot. They sort of minimize the law. There's this idea that you have you have this this sort of very philosophized Judaism. This philosophized Judaism becomes very important very important in a philosophy which is known later on as avarism. Avarism is I thought I had a slide on this, but maybe I'm missing it. So the avarism was this idea that philosophy was more important than religion, or the conclusions of philosophy were more important than the conclusions you get from religion. And so this was something which is seen as a very Maimonidean sort of outgrowth. And in this Maimonidean outgrowth, you have this, you have a Judaism which is just less tethered to the solid tenets of what Judaism is all about. That Judaism has often thrived not because we have this sort of central dogma, this catechism that we teach on a regular basis, but rather because, you know what, we light Shabbos candles and we make hamotzi and we put on tefillin, and those are the things that keep you tied to Judaism. And so the Ashkenazic Jews, they were tefillin Jews. They were Shalashudas Jews. They were Jews who kept all of these details of Jewish law. Spanish Jews, they were philosophical Jews. And so Baer is going to say those philosophical Jews were quite weak. And he's going to say the following. Here's avarism. Avarism, the Latin avarism was the assertion that reason and philosophy are superior to faith and knowledge. So Baer is going to cite two important rabbis, one of which we've already seen, Rabbi Chazdai Kreskas. Rabbi Kreskas is this leading rabbi of Saragossa, and his student, Rabbi Zerachi Halevi. And he says they were directed to reply to such reasonings. These polemical disputations broke out in every community that once regarded itself as the pearl of Spanish Jewry. The practical effects of such discussions was clear enough. Those individuals who habitually looked down upon the simple masses who scrupulously observed all the commandments and were not afraid, even in time of national and religious emergency, to proclaim their faith, these same men, when the test came, lacked the spiritual fortitude to prefer death to apostasy. In much the same spirit they had previously denied the authority of biblical law, they now accepted the rites and ceremonies of the alien religion. Ultimately, they remained faithful to their religion of the intellect, the crowning article of faith for all avarists, whether Jewish or Christian. So you see, in the end, Baer accuses them of basically being philosophically soft. He is not the only one. This is an excerpt from Shem Tov ben Ibn Shem Tov. Shem Tov Ibn Shem Tov is a contemporary of this scenario. And he also says, basically, they were too connected to their money. They were rich, and they didn't have the emotional fortitude. They weren't pious enough. And so the Jews of Ashkenaz, they were quite pious, but the Jews here in Spain, they were, they relative to their Ashkenazic brothers and sisters, they were very, very wealthy, and they were just soft in the middle. There was nothing to be had there. However, I feel a little bit more sympathetic to a more contemporary author, Yirmiyahu Yovel, who wrote this book, The Other Within. This is a relatively recent book, published by Princeton University Press. It's called The Split Identity, and Emerging Modernity. Again, he uses the term Marranos. So, back to that question, we'll have to go back and look at the right terminology. But I think he brings up a really important point. He says the rebuking question, why didn't they commit martyrdom, recalls with due difference the charge that the Jews in Nazi Europe went like sheep to the slaughter, and sounds equally facile. Under conditions reigning them, no other way was open to the wider public. You had two choices, like submit to this angry, awful mob, or take conversion. I got to tell you, I don't know what I would do in that situation. That's a tough choice. And you're a parent with children. What do you tell your children to do? So he says, driven by terror and demoralization, some even converted when the actual assault had not yet occurred or was still uncertain. This is ordinary human conduct, unheroic and uninspiring, but quite natural. To condemn it from a latter-day historian's desk is to confuse realistic history with judgmental moralizing. I think there's some truth to that particular analysis at that point. Okay, now just a couple other points on this scenario. So we want to know, why did Jews in 1391, after this mob riot, why did they convert en masse? And the Jews of the Rhine Valley in 1096, they took the sword. So we've talked about a whole bunch of other things that went on. The Jews in 1096 still had the edict of the Pope, convert. If you convert under duress, the popes were going to reverse it. So there were probably a lot of Jews at that time, they'd not written about in the Chronicles, but they probably did convert. The problem moved on. They went back. They knew they could rely on that. The collapse of the nobility and the king. They didn't have the nobility to protect them in 1391. If you don't have the government to protect you, you got to make it up as you go along. Mob violence from a local population. This is, I think, a very key difference. The Crusader armies that went to the Rhine Valley, they were on their way to Jerusalem. They were moving through the Rhine Valley. They were foreigners. They were not staying. And you just had to wait for things to pass. In the scenario of the Jews bet that they could win that wager. Once that wager wasn't winnable anymore, so then they were stuck. They were in the middle of a battle. They took their lives in a battle. But here, the mob violence is going town to town, from Castile to Aragon, and every town in between. You saw Hasdai Kresgas. You saw all of these cities, Barcelona, Valencia, Seville, Zaragoza, every little town in between. And there are all these little towns in between. 2/3 of the Jewish population of the whole world lives in Spain at this time. Also, the last bit is important. Standard operating procedure was the Maimonides model, which was the Almohades came, they told people convert. You had to say, they had to declare one line. Everybody knew you didn't mean it. And then you put on tefillin the next day. So you convert, you fake for a bit, then you put your tefillin back on. That was the way Jews dealt with these things. This was the model. But the problem is that the papacy wasn't restored for another 25 years. The king did not achieve any power for a similar period of time, and so you have this real threat, which is both aggressive and semi-permanent. It's not going anywhere. So the Jews had very few choices, and so you had lots of people who converted, which brings us to the second important piece of this puzzle, and that is families divided. You have to understand that there are scenarios where one brother converts and the other one doesn't. A husband converts and his wife doesn't. A son converts and his parents don't. You have all of these people who are intertangled. So just to give you a couple of examples of this. So this is we have record of the following scenario. In 1392, a Jew in Yativa refused to do chalitza. So chalitza is the ceremony you do. If your brother dies and he's married and they have no children, then you are by biblical law joined to your sister-in-law by levirate marriage. And the way you dissolve it is through chalitza. But in this case, one brother who lived in Yativa converted, and the other who lived in Valencia remained a Jew. And now what happens? Well, the one who lived in Valencia died. And so now in order for the sister-in-law to get remarried, she needs the Christian brother to do chalitza. So he says, "Oh, I can't go to Valencia because the governor of Valencia is not going to let me in because he's afraid that, I could be pulled back into Judaism because of you." And she had the queen intervene, right? And said that the husband should travel at the father-in-law's expense and perform the ceremony. But you can see that their families here are split up. This is just one example of what happened there. And there are multiple examples, and this becomes part of the story of the Marranos throughout. That the story of this community, the secret Jews, the Anusim, whatever you want to call them, you're going to have a group who converted to Christianity, and then the Christians didn't make them move residences. They didn't say, okay, well, now here's the new Christian community, here's the Christian community, here's the new Christians, and here's the old Jewish community. No, they all lived side by side, and they went to each other's weddings, and you got invited to a bris, and you would be surprised. You would be surprised. The new Christians circumcised their children, right? Now, we haven't met the Inquisition yet, but these Jews still kept many Jewish practices. They ate in Sukkot, they had seders, they occasionally went to shul on Shabbos, right? There's all these intertanglings. And so you have, and this works both ways, but because you had this intertangling of families, you have a lot of people who got schlepped into the Christian situation because their family was swept therein. Okay. So there were some Jews who simply escaped. This is the story of one. Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshet is the single greatest rabbi of the day. He lives in Valencia, and the advantage of living in Valencia is you're right on the port. So you hear that there's problems going on, and it's just a matter of time before it breaks out in your land. And so he gets on a boat and ends up in Algiers, and he becomes the chief rabbi of Algiers, and he is the single greatest rabbi of this era. He's an important person to know, just in terms of background. I used him also an example of Jews who escaped, because the Jewish communities of Morocco and Algeria, the North African Jewish communities, Joseph Marciano, Rabbi Gabbai, etc. This is a bit your story, that these communities are really communities of Spanish Jews who were able to get out between 1391 and perhaps later, but they start in 1391. Okay, now here's the most interesting story of all. Talk about a complicated family dynamic. So this is Pablo de Santa Maria, or he's also known as Rabbeinu Shlomo Halevi, also known as Paul Borges. He is born as Shlomo Halevi. He is a prominent rabbi. As I mentioned before, the greatest rabbi of the day is the Rivash, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshet. This individual, Rabbi Shlomo Halevi, is mentioned 3 times in the Chuvot of the Rivash, which means he was a player. He was a rabbi of great stature. He writes some of his own Chuvot. He's got a Chuva about whether you can use sacks that were used for grain, or you're allowed to use them on Pesach. We have a letter from him. He was a court official. He was a tax farmer. He was very wealthy. He went up to France to negotiate a peace treaty with England, and he writes a letter to his wife, who happened to be the great granddaughter of arguably, I would say, the second greatest of all Spanish rabbis, the Rashba, Rabbi Shimon ben Aderet, very prominent rabbi. So his great granddaughter is this gentleman's wife, Rabbi Shlomo Levi's wife, and he writes her a letter from his trip to England. They're up in England. He's negotiating this peace treaty, and it's Purim time, and he laments, I can't do a proper Purim. I don't have a Megillah, and Shabbos comes, I don't have Kiddush, because all this non-kosher wine here. This France place is really backwards. There's no Omnitskis, there's no Sabras, right? That's his letter. So he lives the life as a very pious Jew. On the 21st of July, 1391, the day after the massacre. So the massacre arrives in his city on the 9th of Av. And Shlomo HaLevi he was wealthy. He had hired many guards to guard the tower, but the mob overtook the guards and they overran the guards. And he manages to escape, and he escapes to the Jewish neighborhood. And the next day, he converts, and he writes a letter to his 5 children that he has done so, and he wants them to convert. He then goes to France to train in the Sorbonne in theology. Now, he has a wife, as I mentioned, Joanna. Joanna is the great granddaughter of this most prominent Spanish rabbi. She's not converting with him. I don't know what craziness got into you, Shlomi, but this is not how we roll, right? To quote the Big Lebowski, right? I sure as bleep don't roll on Shabbos, right? She's keeping Shabbos. She's staying Jewish. He is now converted to Judaism, and he's a very smart guy, and he is very ambitious, and he ultimately becomes the archbishop. And he is a I guess he becomes that symbol of the Jew who converts and sees it as an opportunity for advancement. It is particularly jarring because he's a rabbi, and a rabbi of repute, and his friends and his contemporaries are sort of a list of the most prominent rabbis of the day. Here, just for an example, by the way, is he could not bear the fact that other Jews did not follow his personal example. And whether he's driven by pride or whether he's driven by a need for justification, he needs other Jews to convert, maybe to placate his conscience. And so he writes all sorts of invective and all sorts of books to try and convert the Jews who did not convert when the mobs were rolling through. And he writes them, not only does he write them, he writes them in Hebrew because he wants the Jews to read them. These aren't written for the Christians, these are written for the Jews. And this is just an example of the kinds of things that he writes. It's a little bit odd. It's a sort of you can see the bias dripping off of this interpretation. I chose this because this is a reference to the verse that gives our synagogue its name. But he writes, Pitchuli Sharei Tzedek Avavo Odeya, right, which is open for me the gates of righteousness. I will go through them and I will admit to God. He says, this is the Lord's gate through which the righteous will pass. So Halevi Santa Maria interprets Judaism as the gate through which the righteous Jew, not traitors, should pass to Christianity, thus fulfilling God's promise to Abraham. So he's saying, I see the Tehillim tells you you're supposed to convert. Now, you can appreciate that that's not what this verse says. It's not even remotely what this verse says. This is, this is me twisting the verse in knots in order to say what I want it to say. But you can, this just gives you an example of how he tried to pull the rest of the Jewish community with him. And so this is a little bit of a microcosm of the fact his wife doesn't convert. He makes all of his children convert. So if your question is, well, why do we have this big, wide mass conversion situation? Part of the reason is because there were families that got entangled in this. And one man in the family wanted to schlep all the others over to his side of doing things. And Pablo de Santa Maria is one example of them. You should also know, why did he choose the name Santa Maria? He chooses the name Santa Maria because Mary was was Jewish, and she became Christian. So he wanted to demonstrate he was like Mary. And the Christians didn't like him because he was too tied to the Jewish community. And the Jews didn't like him because they thought he was a traitor. And that is, by the way, the encapsulates the experience of the Converso, the Marrano, is they're not home in either place. They're in a sense lost. They're not fully accepted or trusted by the Jews, and they're certainly not fully trusted by the Christians. And this is sort of some scholars talk about it as sort of a proto-Nazi-like scenario. This guy, he can convert, but really he's not going to be seen as anything but, the Jewish bishop. He's still got that stain of his Judaism on him. And we know, by the way, that he had the story of his conversion, or the rationality behind his conversion, is not even clear to him. We have 3 different arguments in his own hand that tell us why he converted. One was a letter to the rabbi of Pamplona, where he says there's just no hope for the Jews in Spain. God abandoned us. And basically, when the king is not there, the pope is not there, and the population, the lower classes of the population are all storming up against you, you got nowhere to run, you got nowhere to hide. So he said, look, you know what? I saw the game was up, so I jumped to the other side. If you can't beat him, join him. And that was probably the real reason. And a lot of scholars point out the fact that Jews were not allowed to own swords, they were not allowed to own arms. They were seen as sort of the puppets of the nobility who had milked this feudal system. And the Jews were wealthy. This individual was a tax farmer. He was very wealthy. So the lower class was coming after him. It was very much like the Khmelnytsky rebellion, where they attacked the Jews as the agents of the Polish nobility. And so here the Jews are being attacked as the slaves, so to speak, of the nobility. And he saw game was up. Okay, so you know what? I can't beat him. I'm joining him. That's the reason he gives most proximate to his own conversion. He then later on presents 2 others. One, he says, you know what? I looked through the Talmud, and through Talmudic reasoning, I came to believe that, in fact, Jesus is the Messiah. But the church didn't like that, because again, they don't want him to be so tied to his Jewishness. So he said, you know what? Taka, it was also because, or was primarily because I read Augustine and Aquinas and Ichves, and I decided, you know what? The church fathers are brilliant. Jesus must be true. I'm going to be a Christian. So, I think we can take the last one with a grain of salt. All right, I have a couple of okay. All right, so Marcus gave us, I believe, a little bit of a history of the Marrano terms. Let's just catch that up. Marrano is generally a derogatory term referring to Jews who lived in the Iberian Peninsula during the Middle Ages, who chose or were first to convert to Christianity, yet continued to practice Judaism in secret. The more neutral and academic term for the clandestine worship of these secret Jews is crypto-Judaism. The Hebrew term for these outward converts who privately practice Judaism is the more sympathetic term anusim, which means forced ones. Okay, so maybe we should not use the term Marrano quite as freely as we have. So, just one last point on Pablo de Santa Maria, and this perhaps gives you the other side of the coin. His wife Joanna refused to convert, and she predeceased him, and he was obviously a very powerful individual. So he had her buried in the Christian cemetery. But when he died, 2 of his children came back to Judaism. And we'll get into it perhaps next week, but when the popes when the papacy is returned to Rome, and when the king returns to majority, he gives the Jews the option of returning to Judaism. But there are many years which have passed now. And so these 2 sons of his actually do return to Judaism. But this is exactly the portrait I want to leave you with. It's a cholent. It's a mess. You have Jews of all different stripes. You have Jews who converted out who want to come back. You have Jews who became Christian, who said, I'm comfortable this way. I'll eat my Seder. I'll do it in public. Sure, I'll go to the bar mitzvahs. Sure, I'll go to the weddings. I could hear shofar on Rosh Hashanah, but I'll also, take mass. You have every possible permutation of different things going on. And next week, I'm going to try and give us a little bit more detail on some of the texture of what Marrano, I should say, anusim life would be, new Christian, converso life looked like. To be able to see some of the fabric of what it's like to live under these kinds of conditions. But this was a problem not just for the Jews, it's also a problem for the Catholics, because there were Jews who were coming over to become Catholics because they saw, look, you know what, Cousin Chaim converted, and look how well he's done in business. And then there were other Jews who said, you know what, I can't stand listening to the preacher talk and eating the wafer and the wine. I'm going back to be Jewish. And then some people said, you know what, I can manage with both worlds at the same time. Said all these different things happening. But because you had Jews who were being tempted back to Judaism, you had to deal with that. And the crown and the church are going to have to develop a couple of different ways of dealing with this. And I guess to let some of the secrets out of the bag, the Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain are direct byproducts of that very problem. That when you do something like this, you don't get pure Christians, you don't get pure Jews, you just get a cholent. And that cholent is going to be something which creates a splash and ripple and effect that is going to run the course of Jewish history and is going to imprint itself onto Jewish life, I would, without exaggerating, probably to this day. Okay, that will conclude our first lecture. I guess to summarize very quickly, you had a weak crown, you had a weak pope, and you had angry preachers, and they whip up the crowd, and in a moment you have these mass conversions and these riots, these pogroms that go city to city, and people have nowhere to go. There's no protection other than to take the cross. And so in a single event, you have this big mass adoption of Christianity. And in this very short window of time historically, you have the birth of a whole community of people who are secretly keeping Judaism, who are intertwined with their Jewish co-religionists and their Christian co-religionists and their in-between co-religionists, with everything in between. Okay, I guess I've spoken now for 56 minutes, so maybe I should take some questions. Anyone?
Rabbi,
Yes, Dina.
through all of this, isn't it, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was that the Sephardic Torah, the Sephardic way of prayers, is actually the most unchanged of both the when you have Ashkenazi and Sephardi.
Maybe.
Is that correct?
Maybe. Okay, so
I don't know.
you have to.
I thought that
Okay,
there were
so
changes that
you
were
have to.
implemented.
Okay, so it may be so. The origin of the Sephardic community may well be that when Titus expelled the Jews from Rome, they took a bunch of slaves over to Spain to mine copper and tin and various other metals. So maybe they have, I can't answer that because I don't know what that means, that the Sephardic prayer is more authentic. This event,
I think it was just unchanged. It was in its most original form.
It may be. I mean, it could be that if you go from the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon, you go to the history of Siddurim, that maybe the least amount of change and addition is in the Sephardic Siddur.
That being said, also,
but hold on. But don't forget that idea, the Sephardic Siddur. So, Maimonides is Sephardic, and he leaves Spain before any of this happens. Nachmanides is Sephardic, and he leaves Spain before any of this happens. We saw Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshev is Sephardic, and he leaves as it's happening. So there's lots of Sephardic wisdom which is not passed through the pressure chamber of this event.
Okay. Also, then now, how does that the Marrano glass in Venice is from the island of Marrano, and I
Leading ignorance about, I think that might be with an O, and this is an M-A. But
okay.
Marrano means pigs, and Murano is a different spelling altogether.
it's
Okay.
M-U-R.
M-U-R. Okay.
Different word altogether.
Rabbi,
Yes.
one term that was never discussed for Marranos is conversos, and that's the one that I'm most familiar with.
No, I
Nowadays-
threw it around in there, sometimes in the salad of words that I was using. Yes, they're new Christians,
Okay.
Conversos,
Yeah.
Marranos, all of those are words that get used. I don't know how they referred to themselves. Probably the word that they used outwardly most was new Christians. So I can see that there's the terminology is something which is important. So I can try and dig into that.
Well, my understanding was we were in Spain and we were in Toledo and so on. My understanding is that the new Christians were never really accepted, and this went on for generations. They were always known as new Christians. They never really assimilated.
I think, like everything in this period, there's a yes and no for everything, because there were new Christians who married into prominent Christian families. So it's hard to say they were completely not accepted. What happens if you marry into a pure Spanish family, and then a couple generations later? Don't forget this. There are 100 years. There are 100 years between this event and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. That's a lot of generations of Christians, and then you have this new Christian community which exists even after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, because the new Christians aren't expelled from Spain, right? And and the community in Amsterdam, the Portuguese, the community associated with the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam doesn't move to Amsterdam until, 1650 or so, 1648, something like that. I mean, you're adding almost another, at least 150 years after the expulsion to this community. This is a remarkably resilient group of people that managed to bubble themselves. So, yeah, there is. I think that almost everything you say about them can be true. There were certainly Jews who were never accepted as such, and that's why you had an Inquisition, because people needed to prove that these new Christians weren't really like us, and we're not letting them into our country club. Okay, well, I think it's now 9:02, so probably a good time to end this, and I hope you join me for the rest of the series. To me, this is a deep dive into a fascinating community. Okay, everyone have a great night.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.